he said he'd gotten stuck in traffic. But that night, his Uber revealed another truth. The ride ended at the door of a discreet motel, a few miles from home. My heart raced, my hands trembled, and the illuminated screen of my phone seemed to scream silently. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. What he swore was just traffic was, in fact, a lie recorded in digital detail. In that moment, I felt our entire years of relationship was at a crossroads. I've always believed that trust was the foundation of everything, and seeing the app deliver such a stark reality was like being punched in the gut. The cruel irony is that his excuse was not only flimsy, but easily refuted by something as simple as a ride receipt. Technology is unforgiving. It reveals what many try to hide. Still, I swallowed the lump in my throat and said nothing. It wasn't the time. I kept the information hidden like someone who keeps a loaded gun. And as he slept peacefully beside me that night, all I could think was, if this was the beginning, what else was yet to come? In the days that followed, I tried to maintain my routine as if nothing had happened. I made coffee, set the table, and watched him smile as if he were the same man as before. But deep down, every simple gesture seemed tainted by a hidden lie. It was like living next to a stranger wearing the mask of my husband. I remembered how, years ago, he would always arrive with flowers for no reason. Now I barely remembered to ask how my day was. The affectionate details had disappeared without me noticing. And in that silence of routine, the absence screamed louder than any words. I no longer knew if the man I loved still existed. He repeated predictable excuses, always related to work and traffic. The same litany as if it were a rehearsed script. I smiled and pretended to believe, but inside I was already comparing each sentence with the screenshots I kept secret. The weight of each lie accumulated in my memory, ready to collapse. Sometimes he would invent late-night meetings that, curiously, always ended near the same area. That discreet motel seemed to have become the true meeting place. And I, with a heavy heart, simply mentally noted every detail. Patience became my silent weapon. In the house, the atmosphere oscillated between normality and invisible tension. He would arrive, drop his backpack on the couch, and go straight to the shower. I would stand still, observing the clothes, the smells, the schedule. Every detail told me more than his words. I was no longer a wife. I was an investigator. At that time, I realized how the body speaks when the mouth lies. He avoided my gaze, checked his phone excessively, and became irritated by simple questions. The silence between us was no longer one of comfort, but of distrust. It was as if every wall of the house held secrets I could no longer ignore. Deep down, the most painful part was the memory of who we were. Trips, family parties, plans for the future. Everything seemed erased in exchange for cheap moments. He didn't realize he was destroying years of history in a few hidden hours. This was the cruelest betrayal. Not just the body, but the abandonment of everything we'd built. The most perverse was the way he tried to turn the tables. When I questioned something, he'd respond with sharp phrases. "You're seeing things where they don't exist. You're becoming paranoid." He knew exactly how to use my insecurities against me. But Uber doesn't lie. The records were there. I began saving every suspicious ride, every detail that confirmed my suspicions. I stored everything in a hidden folder on my phone. It wasn't just revenge I sought. It was the truth organized, cataloged, ready for confrontation. I was no longer going to be the woman deceived without proof. At night, lying next to him, I stared at the ceiling and felt my heart pounding. He snored peacefully as if nothing had happened. And I, awake, planned in silence. The worst part of betrayal isn't the lie itself, but the daily drama to sustain it. And he played it well. The first time I suspected, I tried to believe it was an exaggeration. But now, each new run, each new broken alibi, was a piece that confirmed the puzzle. It was no longer imagination. It was reality. And it was recorded in data no one could erase. The contrast between his public image and his secret life gnawed at me. To his friends, he was the exemplary husband, the dedicated worker. But I knew that behind the smiles lay a character. It felt like being on a stage, watching a play where only I knew the true script. Once he came home smelling strongly of perfume. He said he was getting a ride from a colleague. I smiled. But inside, the scent clinging to his clothes was more eloquent than any words. With each detail, I better understood how betrayals are made of small oversights. During that period, I began to observe even objects: a forgotten receipt, a hastily deleted message, a nervous look when his cell phone vibrated. I became a signal hunter. Every clue, no matter how small, carried immense weight. It was like living in a minefield, waiting for the next blow. The excuses of traffic became so repetitive they sounded ridiculous. A man might be late once, twice, but when the routine repeats itself at the same time, with the same excuse, it's impossible not to be suspicious. And I, silently, accumulated the evidence he never imagined. With each lie, the anger grew. But it wasn't explosive rage. It was contained, calculated. I knew that screaming wouldn't change anything. What would change would be the moment I had enough evidence to tear down any mask. I waited patiently for the day when he would have nowhere left to run. The days became chapters in a secret soap opera. He played the role of the faithful husband, and I, the role of the naive wife. But behind the scenes, I already had access to the real script. The audience would be surprised, but I already knew the ending. And it was precisely this waiting that strengthened me. I discovered I didn't need to beg. I didn't need to argue. The truth was already revealing itself. And the more he lied, the more he became trapped in his own web of deceit. Still, there was a silent pain that wouldn't let up. Loving someone who lies is like embracing a shadow. It feels real, but there's no substance. I was beginning to realize that, more than proof, what I needed was to decide what to do with it. Silence became my weapon. It wasn't ignorance, it was strategy. He believed he was in control, but little did he know that every lie was already recorded, every excuse already digitally stamped. I didn't need to hunt him down. Technology itself already did that for me. But what I didn't yet know was that soon, a single detail would be the trigger. A mistake he could never erase, and that would forever change the course of our story. That morning, he left in a hurry, saying he had an urgent meeting. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the door slam and the silence filling the house. I grabbed my phone, opened the ride-hailing app, and waited a few minutes. My heart was beating fast, as if I already knew what I was about to find. The race appeared on the screen. The destination was the same motel as always, like a scar that wouldn't heal. I felt a shiver run through me, the cold confirmation of what he swore didn't exist. His lie was always the same, but the evidence piled up like heavy stones on my chest. I looked back at the made bed, his scent still on the sheets. It was strange to think that while I was tidying our house, he was making excuses to live a parallel life. That duality tore me apart inside. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying it. I began to realize how every detail was a reflection of the truth. The hastily typed messages, the sudden blocking of notifications, the rush to turn the phone face down. Everything connected, like pieces of a game he didn't know I was also playing. And I was always one step behind, but watching every move. In the living room mirror, I saw my tired image. It wasn't just that of a betrayed wife, it was that of a woman who needed to decide whether to continue living this charade or break it off for good. But for now, I kept the secret. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted him to fall apart. One night, he came back later than ever. The clock was already past midnight, and I lay awake, pretending to sleep. When he came into the room, I noticed the strange smell on his clothes. It wasn't work sweat. It was someone else's perfume. I closed my eyes tightly, swallowing the scream that wanted to escape. He lay down beside me as if nothing had happened. And I, motionless, wondered how far this act would go. The pillow between us felt like a wall, separating not just bodies, but lives that were no longer connected. The marriage was there, on life support. The next day, over coffee, he commented on the hellish traffic. I almost laughed. The lie was so worn out it sounded pathetic, but I kept my face neutral, just observing. With each excuse, I felt more distant, colder, and at the same time, more determined. The silent investigation became routine. I began checking bank statements, Uber routes, commute times. Every bit of information formed a cruel mosaic. I was no longer just a wife, I was an archivist of my own pain. Every record was guarded like a weapon. Even in trivial situations, he betrayed himself. When his phone vibrated, he would stand up abruptly, as if hiding something valuable. The tension etched on his face spoke louder than any words. And I, silently, noted every gesture, every reaction. The drama was becoming predictable. One Saturday, he said he had a meeting at the office. The excuse was already sounding repetitive, but I allowed it. I discreetly called the company. The security guard confirmed no one was there. It was like receiving another shock, stronger than the previous ones. He no longer bothered to hide it. The weight of each lie began to harden me inside. I no longer cried as much, no longer begged. I just watched. I discovered that revenge begins with coldness, in the ability to hide what one knows. He believed he was still deceiving me, and that was his biggest mistake. One rainy night, while he was talking on the phone in the backyard, I left the window ajar. I heard a female voice on the other end. It wasn't work, it wasn't traffic. It was intimacy. The low, complicit tone ripped away the last shred of innocence I had left. When he came back inside, he smiled, feigning normalcy. But I had heard enough. Every smile of his now felt like poison. The trust, once broken, was now in irreparable shards. There was no way to mend what had been destroyed. The following days were difficult. I lived on alert. Every notification on his phone a trigger. And at the same time, I nurtured my patience. I knew the right moment to act had not yet arrived. The trap needed to be complete. Even at family events, he betrayed himself. He would secretly check his phone, smiling at messages that were never mine. I pretended not to see, but the scene burned me inside. The betrayal wasn't just about my body, it was about my respect, my dignity. I realized it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me, about who I would become after all this. A broken woman or a woman who uses pain as fuel to rebuild herself? That was the real choice I would have to make. The chasm between us grew wider with each passing day. We talked about superficial things, but the essentials were gone. It was like living with a distant neighbor. And yet, he didn't realize the mask was about to slip. That night, I decided I wouldn't just seek proof anymore. Now I sought the final scene. The moment when he could no longer hide, when all the lies would explode before his eyes. And on that day, there would be no turning back. But I never imagined the opportunity would arrive so unexpectedly. A forgotten message, a tiny detail, would be the spark that set everything ablaze. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where routine seems predictable. He left his phone charging in the living room while he went to take a shower. I'd never touched it before, but something about that moment compelled me. I picked it up, my hands sweating. What I found would change everything. Among the notifications, a message slipped through the lock screen. A red heart, accompanied by the phrase, "I already miss yesterday." The blood seemed to freeze in my veins. It wasn't just suspicion or the smell of perfume anymore. It was a confession in the form of a message. I tried to take a deep breath, but my chest felt tight. I stared at those words shining on the screen, as if they were fire burning my eyes. There was concrete, indisputable proof. No alibi, no excuse could undo that heart beating in front of my eyes. I put the phone back before he noticed. I sat back on the couch, trying to act normal, but my hands were shaking. When he came out of the shower, smiling, he kissed me on the cheek as if nothing had happened. I swallowed hard, knowing I now had a trump card. From that moment on, my view of him changed forever. Every gesture, every word, every lie was filtered by the memory of that message. It was like watching a dubbed movie where the voices don't fit. Real life no longer matched the performance he was trying to maintain. In the following days, I began studying every opportunity to gather more evidence. I began following his digital trail, checking receipts, cross-checking schedules, saving screenshots. I discovered that the betrayal didn't happen sporadically. It was routine, meticulously organized into our daily lives. One night, he said he was going to play soccer with friends. I waited for him to leave and minutes later opened the Uber app again. The destination, the same motel. There was no kick, no field, just another lie painted as a cheap excuse. I looked at myself in the mirror and felt a mixture of anger and coldness. I was no longer a victim. I was an investigator. Every lie he told was a step closer to the end. And when the fall came, it would be from a height he never imagined. The irony was cruel. He believed he had everything under control. But technology, relentless, exposed every move. Uber, receipts, messages, digital traces. Everything conspired against him. It was as if the universe itself handed me the pieces of the puzzle. I began planning how the confrontation would play out. I knew I couldn't explode in a moment of rage. It needed to be strategic, precise, definitive. His downfall would have to be public, with no chance of recovery. Revenge would be silent until the last second. One night, a friend invited me out to dinner. I hesitated, but accepted. I wanted to observe his behavior upon learning I had other plans. When I told him, he reacted with suspicion, asking too many questions. Strange for someone who constantly lied. The tables were turning. As I got ready, I realized how I had changed. The suffering was still there, but now it was giving way to a different kind of strength. It was no longer just pain, it was concentrated energy, like a contained fire ready to ignite. I would no longer be a spectator. During dinner, I couldn't help but wonder what he was up to. I checked my phone, and as expected, there was another race. The destination? Always the same. I smiled to myself. He had no idea that every step was monitored, that every excuse was already mapped out. I returned home before him. I waited, sitting in the living room, the lights off. When he came in, he made up the same traffic story. I just nodded, as if I believed him. But inside, a wry laugh echoed. I already had enough proof to dismantle the whole charade. The most painful thing was realizing that he not only betrayed me, but also underestimated my intelligence. He believed I bought his shallow stories. This hurt me more than the betrayal itself. Being seen as a fool was the greater offense. Still, I remained silent. It wasn't time to scream. The scream would come later, but not in words. It would come in evidence. And when the truth exploded, there would be no way to erase the shrapnel. The following nights were torment. He slept peacefully. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and planning. It was as if I were writing a script, and I knew the end was getting closer. I just needed the right detail. And then, on a seemingly ordinary morning, he made a mistake he couldn't erase. A carelessness so simple, yet so fatal, that it tore the curtain of lies apart. That detail was the trigger that turned distrust into a sentence. And from that moment on, nothing would be the same again. That morning, I woke up before him. I made coffee in silence, but my mind was already on alert. His phone, left on the kitchen table, vibrated incessantly. The screen flashed with persistent notifications. It was as if fate were placing the truth in my hands. I picked up the device carefully, my heart racing. The screen showed unread messages in a group of friends. I opened it and swiped up. Amidst jokes and banal conversations, a photo appeared. Him, smiling next to an unknown woman, inside the same motel I already knew well. My stomach churned. The photo wasn't intimate, but the setting was clear. The detail of the wall, the curtain, even the yellowish light. I recognized it immediately because I'd already researched everything about that place. It wasn't just a test, it was a sentence. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, trying to control my breathing. The sound of the shower running in the bathroom seemed to mock me. He, unconcerned, had no idea that at that moment I held the key that would knock off his mask. It was a bitter but powerful feeling. I put my phone back and sat at the table. I stared at my cooling cup of coffee and wondered, how can someone live two lives like this? How can they lie down every night next to the one they swear to love, after betraying them so blatantly? When he emerged from the bathroom already dressed, he looked at me and smiled. A fake, practiced smile that I could now decipher. He said he had another busy day ahead of him. More traffic, more meetings. I just nodded, swallowing my anger, knowing that soon I would turn the tables. Every day, I learned more about myself. I discovered that my strength lay not in confronting him immediately, but in preserving every bit of evidence. It was like preparing a silent courtroom, where he would be the defendant and would have no defense. What hurt most was remembering everything we'd built. Family trips, celebratory nights, future plans. He destroyed it all with selfish haste. For him, they were just secret meetings. For me, it was the crumbling of years of trust. I began to pay closer attention to his excuses. When he mentioned driving, he no longer even looked me in the eye. It was automatic, like someone who repeats a lie so many times they believe it. But I no longer believed anything. I was just accumulating ammunition. One night, before bed, he dropped his wallet on the nightstand. I discreetly opened it. Among cards and receipts was a crumpled receipt. The address was familiar, the same motel. The proof was printed, dated, stamped. He had no escape. I put everything back in its place and lay down beside him. My heart was pounding, but my mind was calm. It was as if with each clue I was transformed further. I was no longer a victim. I was a judge, and judgment was near. At work, I began to notice how distant he became. He responded to my messages coldly, concocted untimely meetings, and avoided calls. He didn't notice, but every absence registered. Every silence, a new confirmation. Even at social events, the mask began to slip. At a party with friends, I noticed how he would step away to answer his cell phone. His eyes shone more at the screen than at any surrounding conversation. That disconnect was glaring, even to those unfamiliar with the story. I no longer suffered as I had before. Now there was a strange calm within me. The pain was still there, but it had been transformed into strategy. Revenge, I realized, doesn't require shouting. It only requires time and intelligence. He continued to believe he was in control. But in truth, he was a hostage to his own recklessness. His every move was being watched, every detail recorded. And the more I trusted my own lie, the deeper it sank. The photo in the group of friends was the spark. From then on, I began to see him no longer as my husband, but as an enemy within my home. Our lives together were a silent battlefield. He laughed, but I saw the abyss behind the smile. That week, he left, saying he was on a business trip. I was alone at home, looking out the window, but his phone vibrated again. This time, it was a confirmed reservation. Not at a work hotel, but at a romantic restaurant for two. The lump in my throat turned into certainty. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He wasn't just sharing his body, but also the promises that should have been mine alone. It was as if he'd stolen a part of my history and offered it to another woman. With each new discovery, I became colder, more prepared. There was no going back. I knew I would soon have to show everything, expose every lie, reveal every piece of evidence. The impact would be devastating. And deep down, I began to long for that moment to arrive. Because his mistake wasn't just cheating, it was believing I'd never be discovered. It was underestimating my intelligence, underestimating my composure. And when the truth came out, he'd meet a version of me he never expected to face. And that version was ready to turn every lie into a sentence, every excuse into condemnation. I just needed to choose the right time. The romantic restaurant reservation echoed in my mind like a scream. It was no longer just a motel and traffic excuses. It was a candlelit dinner, something intimate, something planned. The betrayal had turned into a parallel relationship. It hurt more than any Uber ride. I spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how I'd gotten there. I, who had always been devoted, who had been by his side through every fall, was now just a shadow. He had chosen to offer what was mine to another woman. I woke up with puffy eyes, but with a hardened heart. The next morning I made coffee as usual. He came down smiling, talking about a business trip and endless meetings. As he spoke, all I remembered was the reservation confirmation email. A click of a button had destroyed any chance of a plausible excuse. At work, I began to realize that even my colleagues were suspecting something. Discreet comments, exchanged glances, conversations interrupted when I arrived. The shame he must have felt, I carried alone. But not for long. I already knew that exposure was inevitable. A friend took me aside and said she'd seen him at a mall, walking hand in hand with a woman. She pretended not to tell me anything, but the compassion in her eyes was enough. His lie was no longer hidden. It was becoming public. I returned home that day determined to no longer be a bystander. I opened my secret folder and reviewed every screenshot, every invoice, every digital receipt. The file was extensive, enough to dismantle any defense. It was more than suspicion. It was a complete dossier. As I analyzed everything, I realized my pain had turned to coldness. The woman who had previously wept in silence was now calmly planning. It wasn't just revenge, it was justice. And justice, when it arrives, doesn't ask for permission. That evening, he arrived tired and said he was exhausted from the long meeting. I simply smiled and asked if he wanted tea. I looked into his eyes and saw the confidence of someone who believes they'll never be caught. Little did he know his downfall was near. In the following days, I became an actress in my own home. I smiled, asked trivial questions, feigned interest. But inside, I planned every move. He believed in the role of the naive wife, but the script was already set for the twist. One afternoon, I decided to follow him discreetly. I waited for him to order the car and minutes later opened the app to track it. The destination wasn't a motel this time, but the same restaurant from the reservation. I took a deep breath, ordered my own car, and followed. I arrived early. I sat at a distant table, disguised, and waited. When I saw him enter, holding her hand, I felt the ground shake. The laughter, the knowing look, the gentle touch of his hands. Everything that no longer existed within me. My heart shattered into silent pieces. As they laughed, I simply watched. The waiter served wine, and he toasted enthusiastically. It was a celebration of a lie in broad daylight. I was there, invisible, watching the scene as if I were a stranger. But that pain was turning into fire. I took out my phone and took discreet photos. Each click was like a knife in my chest, but also like ammunition against him. Now they weren't just digital screenshots. They were vivid images, impossible to deny. Reality was captured from angles he couldn't erase. I returned home without him seeing me. I sat in the dark living room, looking at the photos on the screen. Tears flowed, but with them came the certainty. I didn't need to wait any longer. The game was set. I held the naked truth in my hands. That night, when he arrived, he brought flowers. The gesture that had once been sincere now felt like an insult. He placed the flowers on the table, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "I thought about you the whole time." The lie sounded sweet, but to me it tasted like poison. I smiled and thanked him. But inside me, the volcano was already about to explode. The flowers remained there, like witnesses to the falsehood. I didn't see them as a gift, but as a symbol of the farce he was trying to maintain. I lay in bed and realized how irreversible the distance between us was. His touch no longer had any effect. His voice sounded distant. His promises empty. I was no longer a wife. I was a survivor, ready to break free from an invisible prison. I spent the next few days planning the best way to expose everything. It wasn't just for me. It was so he would feel the weight of his own choices. So he would understand that every lie has consequences, that every betrayal exacts a price. And fate, capricious as it may be, was about to give me the perfect opportunity. A social event surrounded by friends and family would be the ideal stage. There, in front of everyone, the truth would come out, leaving him nowhere to run. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't screaming. It's showing everyone, all at once, what was hidden. And that night, his world would crumble. The social event arrived, and the house was full. Longtime friends, close family, all gathered in a celebratory atmosphere. He seemed relaxed, greeting everyone, laughing loudly, as if he were the perfect man. The performance was impeccable. I took in every detail. The neat suit, the forced smile, the cell phone tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket. To everyone, he was the epitome of a devoted husband. But only I knew that behind that mask lay a web of lies about to unravel. As he toasted with friends, he talked about business, travel, and professional achievements. The audience applauded. But I looked and saw only an actor. A man playing the role of a faithful husband, unaware that the curtains were about to fall. In the middle of the party, a message vibrated on his cell phone. He discreetly walked away, thinking no one would notice. But I did. I saw the sparkle in his eyes when he read the screen, the same sparkle that was no longer there when he looked at me. I walked back to the table and calmly set up my own scene. I grabbed my phone, opened the secret folder, and selected the photos. I set the brightness to maximum and left the screen on the table. It was only a matter of time before someone curious took a look. And so it happened. A cousin approached, saw the images, and widened her eyes. She called someone else, and within seconds the photo was being passed from hand to hand. Murmurs began to ripple through the room. The laughter of the party gave way to an uncomfortable silence. He returned to the living room, not understanding anything. He noticed the stares, the whispers, the weight of the air. When he noticed my phone on the table, he instantly blushed. His mask began to crack in front of everyone. His aunt bluntly asked loudly, "Is this true?" The entire room froze. He tried to laugh, to change the subject, but his voice faltered. The photos weren't rumors, they were proof. And there was no way out. His friends looked at each other, some in shock, others already muttering criticism. His reputation, built over years of theater, began to crumble in minutes. It was like watching a house of cards collapse with a single breath. He tried to approach me, murmuring, "Why did you do that?" But I just stared at him, cold, without answering. The answer lay in the images everyone saw. I didn't need to speak. The truth spoke for me. The anger in his eyes mixed with fear. Fear of losing the perfect image he'd always cultivated. Fear of facing the consequences of his own choices. He, who had always believed he was in control, was now surrounded, exposed, defeated. Some friends backed away. Others glared at him with contempt. The women in his family shook their heads in disapproval. The piercing silence was worse than any scream. He was alone in the crowd. I stood firm, without crying, without trembling. It was my moment of silent victory. He never imagined I would have the courage, and precisely because of that, the impact was devastating. He tried to delete the images from my phone, but it was too late. Several guests had taken photos of the trials. What had been a private secret was now public. What had been just between the two of us became a social judgment. The party ended in chaos. Guests left, chatting, the family torn between shock and outrage. I stood there steadfast, watching the collapse of the persona he'd built for so many years. When we were finally alone, he tried to justify himself. He made excuses, spoke of regret, begged for forgiveness. But every word sounded like another lie. And I no longer had room for illusions. I looked him in the eye and simply said, "You dug your own grave." He shuddered, perhaps for the first time understanding that it was over. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in months. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because I finally put the truth in its place. The weight I'd carried turned to relief. But what I didn't yet know was that his downfall wouldn't stop there. The consequences would extend beyond his family, beyond his friends. His world would crumble in places he never expected it to be hit. The morning after the scandal, I woke up to dozens of messages on my cell phone. Friends asked if it was true. Relatives sent screenshots. Acquaintances commented in astonishment. The secret he'd kept for months had become a collective issue. The lie no longer belonged solely to us. He left home early, dejected, avoiding my gaze. He didn't drink coffee, said nothing, just left. The silence was the clearest confession I'd ever received. There was no possible explanation for what everyone had seen, and he knew it. As I tidied the house, I noticed how charged the room was. Every object seemed imbued with distorted memories. The cup he used, the shirt hanging on the chair, the perfume still in the air. Everything became a memory of a crumbling theater. The phone rang. It was his mother. In a firm voice, she asked if the photos were real. I simply answered yes. On the other end, silence. Then, a heavy sigh and the sentence, "I always suspected." I realized his mask wasn't fooling even those closest to him. While at work, I learned that colleagues were already talking about the case. The photo circulated in groups, accompanied by comments and jokes. The man who had always boasted about his reputation was now a laughingstock. His downfall was just beginning. When he arrived home that night, the weight of the world was in his eyes. He tried to talk to me, but I merely watched. His mouth moved, but I only heard the messages on my phone, the comments, the humiliation he was trying to erase. It was too late. He swore it was a mistake, that he had lost control, that he regretted it. The words came out quickly, desperately. But regret without truth is nothing. I no longer saw a man. I only saw an actor trying to improvise after forgetting his lines. As he spoke, I remembered every night he had called me paranoid. Every time he had made me doubt myself. Now he was the one trembling before the truth. The role reversal was cruel but necessary. In the following days, he became a shadow of his former self. The confident man vanished. Only a haggard body remained, avoiding glances, cowering in shame. Every time he looked at me, he seemed to be begging for a chance. But there was no longer room. A friend said something I've never forgotten. "You won when he lost control of his own lie." That phrase resonated strongly. It wasn't about revenge anymore, but about liberation. I was free, and he was trapped in his own trap. I began to notice signs of desperation. He avoided going out, deleted contacts from his phone, closed social media. He tried to rebuild his shattered image, but the internet doesn't forget. What circulated wouldn't return to silence. One afternoon, he came home distraught. He said that people at work were already looking at him differently, that even clients were whispering. The lie had penetrated the family walls. Now it was affecting his career, his livelihood, his professional reputation. I looked at him and felt no pity. I remembered how many times I'd begged for the truth and received only theatrics. Now he was the one begging for silence, and I was the one with the power of words. The balance had shifted. Little by little, he began to avoid any confrontation. I slept in another room, avoided conversation, and spent hours locked in silence. His presence in the house was a ghost. To me, he was no longer a companion, a stranger taking up space. One night, I found a letter on the table. Words of regret, promises to change, pleas for forgiveness. I read each line coldly. They were no different from the apologies I'd heard so many times. Paper doesn't erase scars. The flowers reappeared. Bouquets left in the living room, chocolates, gifts. All useless. What once meant love now felt like a bribe. He didn't understand that trust isn't bought. It's built. And his was in ruins. A neighbor commented to me in the elevator. "I saw your husband the other day. He's finished." I smiled slightly. He was paying the price life exacts when you believe yourself unattainable. The social humiliation was merely a reflection of the intimate humiliation he'd inflicted on me. Sometimes I still woke up in the middle of the night with tears in my eyes. Not because I missed him, but because I missed who he pretended to be. I missed the man beside me, but the illusion he'd shattered. Deep down, I knew I needed to make a final decision. It wasn't enough to expose myself. It wasn't enough to watch the fall. I needed to close this chapter, cut the last thread that still held us together. I spoke to lawyers. I listened to every piece of advice, every necessary step. I discovered that, beyond the pain, I had rights. And these rights would be my final weapon. Social justice had already begun. Now would come legal justice. He noticed my movements and panicked. He tried to reverse the situation, beg, promise change. But every word tasted like a lie. I no longer saw a future, only a man desperate not to lose everything. I began to ignore his attempts. I didn't respond to messages. I didn't listen to excuses. The silence that had once suffocated me was now my shield. He couldn't bear being ignored because for the first time, there was no stage, no audience. Little by little, the house grew cold. He tried to get closer, but there was no longer space. Every corner, every object, every memory screamed that the story was over. All that remained was to sign the sentence. My family supported me. Some said I should have done it sooner. Others embraced me silently, understanding the pain without words. The support network he'd tried to break now strengthened me. His friends drifted away, some out of shame, others out of disapproval. He was isolated, without allies, without excuses. The man he'd always believed he was admired now walked alone, carrying the weight of his own choices. One Sunday night, I sat on the couch with all the documents organized, the folder with evidence, messages, receipts. It was the final dossier. He walked into the room and froze when he saw everything before me. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. I didn't need to shout. I simply slid the evidence across the table and said, "It's all here, from beginning to end." He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. The silence that followed was the definitive confirmation of the end. I felt a strange peace in that moment. It wasn't joy, it wasn't revenge. It was simply liberation. I had closed the cycle. He had no more weapons, no more excuses, no more escape routes. He was cornered by the truth itself. But even with everything, something told me it wasn't the end yet. The impact he would suffer would still spread beyond our walls. His downfall would become an example. And the outcome was about to be even more devastating. Because when a lie is exposed, it doesn't just destroy those who live it. It corrodes homes, friendships, reputations. And he was about to experience this destruction in its cruelest form. The morning after the silent confrontation, he left the house with his head down. His eyes sunken, his posture hunched, as if carrying the weight of a crumbling world. For the first time, I saw in him not a husband, but a defeated man. It was the inevitable consequence of so many bad choices. While he dragged himself to maintain a semblance of normalcy, life around him was giving him no respite. At work, the gossip intensified. Colleagues whispered when he entered, clients avoided long greetings. The reputation he had so carefully cultivated was in ruins. Childhood friends, once loyal, now drifted away. Some no longer answered his calls. Others more bluntly said, "You destroyed everything by yourself." He tried to hide it, but I knew each rejection crushed him more than any words of mine could. At home, the loneliness became unbearable for him. I saw him wandering the rooms, sitting for long minutes staring into space. The man who once commanded conversations now fell silent before the echo of his own lies. Sometimes he tried to talk to me, but I didn't respond. Silence became my most powerful response. He, who had used so many words to manipulate, now found himself powerless in the face of my coldness. There was no longer any dialogue, only distance. Every day, more messages arrived. Women who knew the story, friends who supported me, even strangers who said, "I went through the same thing." I realized my pain wasn't just mine. It was part of a collective wound that spanned generations. A neighbor commented at the gate, "He always seemed perfect, but look at that." I smiled silently. The mask he'd worn for years had slipped. Now, everyone saw not the exemplary husband, but the hidden traitor. Deep down, I knew there was still a bigger battle: justice. I already had the evidence, the files. Now it was a matter of transforming pain into documents, resentment into legal judgment. The wound needed closure. He started coming home late, not because of betrayal, but because of shame. It took him a while to face the heavy atmosphere in our living room, the looks that needed no words. He knew every minute there was a silent sentence. One afternoon, I saw his cell phone on the table. There were no more messages from lovers, only billing notifications, unanswered emails, work alerts. The betrayal hadn't just destroyed his marriage. It was beginning to corrode his entire life. He tried to get closer again. He brought prepared dinners, offered rides, tried to rekindle conversations, but it was too late. Nothing he did would erase the trail of pain left behind. Trust, once broken, isn't rebuilt with small gestures. While he tried to pick up the pieces, I was already moving in a different direction. I spoke with lawyers, organized paperwork, and opened firm talks about separation. There was no room for doubt. The decision was made. His shock upon realizing I wasn't hesitating was immense. He expected tears, pleas, and insecurity. He found firmness. The woman he'd tried to manipulate was now unyielding. This was his most bitter revenge. In social circles, the most common comment was, "She was strong." People were surprised by my demeanor. There was no hysteria, no spectacle, just firmness. This destroyed him even more because he couldn't paint me as unbalanced. At family gatherings, no one looked at him the same way anymore. The jokes, the whispers, the sidelong glances followed him into every room. He tried to smile, but the smile died before it could even begin. He knew he would never regain that respect. One night he came home drunk, trying to convince me that everything could go back to the way it was before. He talked loudly, cried, and banged on the table. I just stared at him in silence. The scene was pathetic. There was no turning back time. With each outburst of his, I grew calmer. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it no longer mattered. He no longer had power over me. The reins were firmly in my hands, and I had no intention of letting go. I discovered a strength within myself I never imagined. With each firm step I took, more women around me looked to me for inspiration. I understood that my struggle wasn't just personal. It was a symbol of something bigger. At his work, his superiors began to put pressure on him. The company's image was tarnished by the scandal swirling around. His lie hadn't been confined to his home. Now it even affected contracts and projects. He came to me in despair, saying he could lose his job. He expected compassion, but I didn't offer it. I simply said, "Every choice has a price." He fell silent, swallowing the weight of the sentence. The days became long and heavy for him. Every time he looked at me, he no longer saw his wife, but the judge of his downfall. He couldn't stand the mirror I represented. Meanwhile, I breathed a sigh of relief. Not because the pain was over, but because I was finally at peace with the truth. Carrying lies is unbearable. Seeing the truth exposed, however cruel, is liberating. He still insisted on asking for forgiveness. He wrote long messages, promising therapy, changes, transformations. But it was all too late. The promises that had once deceived me now sounded like jokes. In a last-ditch attempt, he brought a planned trip, saying we could start over. I simply looked and said, "There is no new beginning when there is no more us." The silence that followed was definitive. The man who had once controlled the narrative was now just a shadow. The streets he had once walked with confidence now looked at him with contempt. The mask had fallen, and he would never regain it. I, on the other hand, began to feel the lightness of the future. It wasn't happiness yet, but it was relief. Life was ready to be rebuilt, brick by brick, but now on truth, not theater. On a rainy afternoon, I packed my things. I put mementos in boxes, closed doors, and planned my exit. He watched me silently, not daring to stop me. He knew nothing I said would change my decision. The sound of the key turning in the door was the final release. It wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of an emotional prison. I took a deep breath, smelling the rain, and realized I was free. But something inside me told me his downfall was just beginning. The world around him would exact an even higher toll, and he would have to face the storm he'd created alone. As I closed the front door behind me, I felt a different wind blow against my face. It was as if the entire universe was telling me the prison was over. That space that had once suffocated me now belonged only to him and his lies. I carried nothing from there with me anymore, only the certainty that I was free. I walked to the car slowly, as if each step were a victory. For years, every exit had been accompanied by anxiety. Would he lie again? Not now. Every movement was mine. Every choice was mine. For the first time in a long time, I breathed without fear. The first few nights were strange. The silence, which had once been torture, now sounded like music. There were no hidden messages, no made-up excuses, no averted glances. The emptiness surrounding me wasn't loneliness. It was pure freedom. I lay down in my new bed and noticed the space beside me. Before, filled with someone who no longer existed. Now, it was a space of possibilities. There were no more walls filled with lies, just a roof above me and the feeling of a new beginning. I remembered every night I cried alone, swallowing the pain in silence. Now those tears had become fuel. It was no longer fragility, it was strength. I had survived the worst and was still standing. The phone rang nonstop. Friends wanted to know how I was. Family offered support. Acquaintances sent me messages of solidarity. Every word I received showed me that I was not alone. My struggle echoed in the lives of many others. I gradually discovered that my pain was not isolated. It was shared by dozens of women who had experienced silent betrayal. Many had never spoken, out of fear or shame. Hearing their stories, I realized my victory was theirs too. In each message, one phrase repeated itself. You were brave. Brave for not remaining silent. Brave for facing it. Brave for not accepting the role of eternal victim. I understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the decision not to bow to it. While I was rebuilding, he was crumbling. Friends drifted away, colleagues whispered, family looked on with disapproval. The man who had once believed himself admired was now a pariah. The reputation built over years turned to dust in weeks. Sometimes I still received messages from him. Long, full of promises. Desperate texts saying he would change, that he would do everything differently. But every word reminded me of the nights I heard the same promises staring into his eyes. Promises that never came true. I deleted some, read others in silence. In none of them did I feel truth. Only despair. It wasn't love. It was fear of losing the control he'd always believed he had over me. That power no longer existed. I had broken the chain. With each step forward, I grew further away from him. I discovered pleasures I'd forgotten, walking slowly, cooking just for myself, choosing movies without having to negotiate. The simple became grand. The ordinary became extraordinary. I reconnected with friends he'd pushed away. Between hugs and laughter, I realized how much I'd lost trying to sustain a failing marriage. Each reunion was a piece of my identity returning. I wasn't just a wife. I was a woman, a friend, a daughter, a professional. I traveled alone for the first time in years. On the plane, looking out the window, I felt a lump in my throat. Not of sadness, but of fulfillment. I was rediscovering who I was without his shadow. The horizon was mine, and no one could steal that from me. He, on the other hand, was sinking into emotional and social debt. Colleagues no longer trusted me. Contracts were lost. Clients abandoned business deals. The price of the lie was higher than he could pay. His mother called me one day, in tears. She apologized, saying she'd always suspected but never imagined it would be so serious. I listened in silence. It wasn't me she owed an apology to. It was him she owed, and life was already taking its toll. When I saw him by chance on the street, I barely recognized him. He was thin, haggard, his eyes dull. He tried to smile at me, but it was a broken smile, like cracked glass. There was nothing left in him that resembled the man I knew. In that moment, I realized the power of indifference. I felt no hate. I felt no love. I felt no pity. Just nothing. It was the greatest proof that I had won. He no longer had power over my emotions. I began to write. I turned my memories into pages. Each line was a piece of pain transformed into a scar. Writing didn't erase, but healed. Each word freed me a little more. Publishing my story in short texts brought unexpected rewards. Women I'd never met wrote to me, thanking me for giving voice to what they hadn't the courage to say. I discovered that my liberation was also a path for others. In court, the process moved forward. Papers, documents, evidence. Each signature was a brick removed from the wall that united us. There was no turning back. The end was official, and with it, my new life. He tried to resist, tried to drag things along, tried to bargain. But every time he moved, he sank deeper. It was like quicksand. The more he tried to escape, the faster he was swallowed up. I, on the other hand, walked steadily. I no longer trembled in front of lawyers or hearings. With each step, my heart beat faster. Not with fear, but with victory. I was finally taking control of my story. I discovered I no longer needed to justify anything to anyone. I owed no explanations, no apologies. The weight of social judgment had turned against him. I was free even from the gaze of others. The new house began to fill with life. Plants, photos, small details chosen by me. Nothing reminded me of the past. Every corner breathed truth. And the truth, even harsh, is always lighter than a lie. Sometimes the silence still frightened me, but I soon realized it was a good silence. It wasn't absence, it was space. Space for myself, space for the future, space for dreams yet to be born. The days began to have color. I smiled alone again, sang in the shower, looked at myself in the mirror without guilt. I no longer saw a broken woman. I saw a woman rebuilt, stronger than before. At every meal, on every walk, I remembered, I owe nothing to anyone. I am not defined by what he did. I am defined by how I rose. And I rose whole. Friends asked me how I did it. I replied, it wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Because living with lies is worse than facing the pain of truth. And that lesson I would never forget. He kept trying. Messages, letters, flowers, all useless. Every gesture felt like poorly rehearsed theater. I no longer watched the play. I had already left the stage. I discovered that forgiving wasn't forgetting. It was simply letting go of the rope that bound me to him. Not to free him from guilt, but to free myself from the weight. And as I let go, I felt my wings grow. On cold nights, I remembered the past. Not with longing, but with learning. Every detail was a lesson. And each lesson made me more prepared for what was to come. I realized that what strengthened me most wasn't revenge, it was justice. Seeing him pay for every lie was painful but necessary, not because I wanted to see him suffer, but because I needed to see the truth prevail. I discovered that pain can be transformed into a weapon, not to hurt, but to protect. And that's what I did. I turned every scar into armor. Now nothing could bring me down in the same way. Little by little, I learned to smile again. Not forced smiles, Not fake smiles. Genuine smiles. Born from within, for no particular reason. Simply because I was alive and free. The future, which once seemed threatening, was now an open horizon. I could be whoever I wanted, do whatever I wanted, without having to ask permission. That was the true victory. I discovered that the worst betrayal wasn't his betrayal of me. It was my betrayal of myself, when I accepted crumbs believing they were love. But that was in the past. Now I only accepted real feasts. Each day without him was a day of healing. Each morning was a rebirth. The weight of yesterday no longer held me back. I walked lightly, with firm steps toward a different tomorrow. I was no longer afraid of being alone. Loneliness stopped being a ghost and became a companion. I learned that being alone is better than being in bad company. And that was one of the greatest lessons. What he lost wasn't just me. It was respect, credibility, dignity. He lost everything. I, in contrast, gained the most valuable thing: myself. Today, I look back and no longer see myself as a victim. I see myself as a survivor. And more than that, as a victor. Because surviving is already a victory. But winning is never again accepting the same chains. I learned that I don't need someone to validate who I am. My identity isn't limited to being a wife, to being one half of a couple. I am whole, and always have been. He just tried to convince me otherwise. The world, which once seemed small, was now huge. I could explore, learn, start over. Every corner, every street, every journey was a possibility. I was alive. I celebrated every achievement, no matter how small. A plant that grew, a bill paid with effort, a trip planned alone. Everything was a symbol of independence. The past still hurts, it's true. But it no longer governs my decisions. Pain is a scar, not an open wound. And scars don't hurt. They merely remind me. Today I understand that his lie didn't destroy my life. On the contrary, it pushed me onto the path to freedom. It made me see my strength, my courage, my essence. I know that many women still live trapped in stories like mine, and it pains me to know this. But I also know that my voice can inspire others to free themselves. And that's what I want, to be an example that it's possible. Because no one deserves to live imprisoned by excuses. No one deserves to be deceived in silence. No one deserves to carry the weight of a lie they didn't choose. Life has taught me that intuition never fails. There are always signs. There are always details. The mistake lies in ignoring them. And I've learned to never again ignore what my heart warns me about. Now I leave you with a question. How many more will have to suffer in silence for the truth to be heard? Because my story is over. But the fight against lies is just beginning. At first, I believed revenge was the answer. But over time, I realized that my greatest victory was freeing myself. Revenge binds, freedom releases. He was trapped in his own lies, and I walked freely in my own future. I still hear comments from people who know him. Some say he's changed, others that he's still the same. But it doesn't matter to me. I'm no longer interested in following the life of someone who destroyed my trust. I've learned that curiosity about what happens to others is a trap. What matters is what I do with my life from now on. And my life no longer depends on secrets, but on transparent choices. Today, when I see couples on the street, I don't feel envy. I feel hope. Because I know that true relationships exist. But I also know that I don't need them to be whole. The most important love is self-love. My days have been filled with me. I've gone back to studying, investing in personal projects, caring for things I once abandoned. Every small achievement is proof that I'm on the right path. There's no longer any guilt in me. For a long time, I carried the feeling that I failed, that I wasn't enough. Today, I know the fault was never mine. The choice to cheat was always his, and his alone. This awareness has freed me once and for all. I realize that I don't owe anyone an explanation for another's infidelity. I'm not responsible for the choices of those who failed to appreciate what they had. Each morning, I wake with lightness. The sun streaming through the window no longer illuminates shadows, but possibilities. Everything that once seemed like a prison has now become a horizon. And even though the pain has marked me, I don't let it define me. Scars don't define who we are. They only tell where we came from. I am not my pain. I am my victory over it. He still tries, from time to time, to send signals. Unanswered calls, gifts left at the door, unanswered messages. But nothing reaches me anymore. The wall between us is insurmountable. The woman who once believed in cheap excuses no longer exists. She died along with each lie revealed. In her place, someone stronger, more aware, and more whole was born. I rediscovered the pleasure of solitude. Dining alone is no longer sadness, it's celebration. Walking without company isn't emptiness, it's freedom. What once felt like absence is now my own presence. I discovered that loving my own company is the foundation of everything. Only then, one day, if I want to, will I be able to share my life again. But not out of necessity, only by choice. I'm often asked if I've forgiven him. The answer is simple. I've forgiven myself, not him. Forgiveness is personal liberation, not the absolution of others. Let him deal with his guilt. The world has a curious way of returning what we offer. He offered me a lie and reaps shame. I chose truth, and today I reap freedom. Life doesn't fail. In court, I heard lawyers discussing details that had previously pained me. But as they spoke, I no longer felt any pain. I felt firm. Every word was a step towards the definitive end. When the separation was made official, I felt my heart beat at a different rhythm. It wasn't fear, it was peace. An entire chapter had been closed, and the following pages were blank, ready for me. I picked up the invisible pen of life and started writing my new story. No erasures, no secrets, no farces. Just clean lines written by my own hands. I learned that no one deserves to live asking for crumbs of love. Real love doesn't need justifications. It doesn't ask for eternal apologies. It doesn't hide in lame excuses. Today, when someone calls me strong, I smile. Because I know that strength was not born alone. It was forged in every tear, in every silence, in every test that I gathered myself. To every woman who comes to me saying that she experiences something similar, I repeat, listen to your intuition. She never fails. The mind may doubt, but the heart always knows. I doubted it myself so many times. I thought I was exaggerating, that I was paranoid, but it wasn't. The signs were there, clear, sharp. The mistake was ignoring them out of love. Love that is not reciprocated becomes prison. And I no longer accept handcuffs disguised as affection. True love is freedom. It is not suffocation. My life today is proof of this. I take a deep breath, make decisions, follow paths. None of them are afraid of being deceived anymore. Everyone goes through the desire to be happy. I don't hold any regrets. Holding a grudge means remaining stuck in the past. I let go, let go. The past no longer rules me. It just taught me to never accept less than I deserve. When I look in the mirror, I see a different woman. More mature, more aware, more whole. A woman who doesn't need excuses because she already understands the value of her own truth. And I know that when he sees me today, he recognizes his defeat. Not because he lost me, but because he lost himself. What destroyed was not just my love, it was his own dignity. Deep down, the cruelest punishment wasn't that I left. It was him being left with the void he built. And this emptiness, he will carry forever. I, on the other hand, stay light. What was once pain became learning. What was once prison became freedom. What was once silence became voice. And now I ask you, if it were you, would you have the courage to face the truth? Or would you continue living the lie?